A core responsibility of a clinical research professional is to ensure clinical trial documentation is complete, accurate, and ready for regulatory inspection. To discuss what regulatory inspection entails, I invited Donna Dorozinsky, founder and CEO of Just-in-Time GCP, to the show. Donna is a business consultant with over 30 years of experience in clinical study operations that includes clinical operations, safety, data management, biostatistics, clinical supply management, and trial master file management. Her vast experiences dealing with small to large pharmaceutical companies, academic centers, regulatory agencies, and clinical research organizations and investigator sites provides her with the knowledge to assist research organizations in all areas of clinical compliance. Donna began her career in clinical research at GlaxoSmithKline, where she spent 15 years in phase 1 clinical research operations. In 2005, Donna founded Just-in-Time GCP. In her capacity as founder and CEO, she has built an organization that is highly respected within the clinical compliance and trial master file management services industry. As a consultant, she has led projects performing operational gap analysis and implementing process improvement initiatives for sponsors, CROs, and clinical trial sites. She has extensive experience in inspection readiness/preparation and has assisted organizations in developing and executing remediations across eClinical systems, quality management systems, and trial master file services. Donna has presented training programs in topics of GCP compliance, quality management systems, inspection readiness, and trial master file management. She is the lead editor in the newest edition of Good Clinical Practice, a question and answer guide 2024-2025 edition. She's a member of the Trial Master File Reference Model Steering Committee and was recently named as Ernst Young Entrepreneur of the Year. Under Donna's leadership, Just-in-Time GCP was named among Best Places to Work by Inc. magazine. Donna earned a Bachelor's of Science in Nursing from Guyvend Mercy University, where she is currently serving as a member of the Board of Trustees, and Master of Science in Nursing from Widener University. Please join me in welcoming Donna Dorozinsky on the Clinical Trial Podcast.
Great clinical research professionals aren't born, they're built. In each episode, hear from leading experts in clinical trial management as they inspire and motivate you to become an effective leader. Welcome to the Clinical Trial Podcast. Here to help you accelerate your career is your host, Kunal Sampat.
Donna, thank you so much for accepting my invite and joining me on the Clinical Trial Podcast. We met at Scope earlier this year, and I was really wowed by all the work that you and your team have been doing. I want to maybe start off with the book that you've published with other authors, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what led you to create that material for the clinical research industry.
Sure. Yes, great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I think the motivator for me is I've been using that book as long as I can remember. I remember when I started my consulting business back in the early 2000s, I read the book from cover to cover. I felt like it was an incredible resource to me as someone who had been in the industry actually for 15 years. So was fairly knowledgeable about clinical compliance, but yet I felt like I also I wanted to make sure that I knew my stuff as I went out there and started to do consulting. And so it was a great tool for me to have to go back to and kind of just check on myself, right? Make sure what I was telling the client was fact-based, was based on an appropriate interpretation of the regulations. And so about, I guess maybe in 2018, 2016, they were doing a new edition, and I had been doing some training for Barnett. I had been one of their trainers. And so they wanted to add a new chapter on Trial Master File. I've been involved with Trial Master File since probably like 2007, and really as long as I've been in clinical research, I've been working with the Trial Master File. But certainly more of expertise involved with the TMF reference model. So we added a chapter on Trial Master File in that edition. And so over the past several editions, I've been one of the chapter editors, so working on that particular chapter. A couple of years ago, I did some presenting for Barnett and just kind of some GCP compliance work, developed a relationship with them. And so they had a need for a new editor, and they approached me about it. I was super excited because I kind of had a vision for how I felt that the resource needed to evolve. The book was very much FDA centric, very US centric, and in the past several years, and I certainly think the pandemic jump started this, but it became you don't run a US only trial very often. Most clinical trials are global trials to some degree, even if it's only two countries, US and Canada. And so we needed to offer a perspective that wasn't US centric, but GCP centric. And so I wanted to be able to influence that and really add those country specific requirements within the topic, as opposed to having a separate chapter for each of the different countries. And so it was an opportunity to add new editors, some additional chapter authors, and to add new content. Clinical trials has really evolved. We weren't talking about decentralized clinical trials 4 or 5 years ago. We weren't, we've had so many new regulations and guidances since the pandemic. So I just saw it as an opportunity to really refresh what's out there and available as a resource for GCP.
Got it. I want to maybe talk about like the current state of like GCP within the industry. Like I think just conducting clinical trials, I think one of the requirements is the doctor certified or trained on GCP. Do you think is that sufficient? Like, is there what are the limitations of just getting a certification, through an online portal?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of thoughts around this. I think the first is that Accelerate has done a really nice job of setting core curriculum for investigator site training. And so certainly if someone wants to get training in GCP, that's a really good place to start. Go with a course that is certified in terms of its curriculum based on the Accelerate requirements. That's a way of ensuring that sponsors will accept your specific GCP training. The other part is like, let's make it interesting, right? So one of the things that we've tried to do in developing our GCP training is make it relatable, right? So just having to sit in front of your computer and select a bunch of things and check this box and check that box. And at the end, you can say, yep, I got it done. We've all done that training where we hit play and we're sending emails and we're writing notes and we may even be making dinner, right? We're just checking the box to say we did it. I think people should seek out training that's actually relatable to what they do, that provides examples. It's not just reciting regulations, but how does that regulation connect? For example, investigators should be qualified through training and experience. What does that actually mean, right? Does that mean that I took some courses in GCP and that makes me a qualified investigator? Probably not, right? So I think that when you're selecting your training, you select something that relates to your area of expertise, what you do, so that you can connect to it and ultimately you can learn from it.
Yeah. So are there, like, I'm just trying to think. So there's different points of view. So from a sponsor perspective, do you think like just collecting that GCP certification is enough, or do you think sponsors should also be like doing additional training with the investigators as part of the site initiation visit or any sort of add-on training?
I think if you have an investigator, I think it's different, right? If you have a new investigator, then maybe you do need to just review some basic GCP. But if you have an experienced investigator, chances are really good they've done training multiple times. I think it's more important to focus on things that are specific to that particular protocol. Because by focusing on that particular protocol, in essence, you're giving GCP training. And so for me, I don't think it's so important. The SIV needs to have a whole section on GCP training, but I think it needs to do a really good job of ensuring that that investigator and that investigator staff, right, the clinical research coordinator, the pharmacist, the med tech, that they really understand the protocol and their responsibilities for that study. And then that training needs to be documented, not just in the SIV report, but in some kind of protocol training documentation.
Yeah. So I agree, like the training needs to be interesting to keep us engaged. One of the recommendations, and I want to get your thoughts on this, but I tell people like read the 66-page FDA guidance document on GCP. I feel like if you do that once, you're going to learn so much. Just kind of, when we started this conversation, you said you read the book cover to cover, right? And I feel like along the same lines, just reading that guidance document just gives you so such good insights that it's yeah, I don't know what you think about that. Do you feel like the guidance documents is something that investigators and sponsor staff should read to learn GCP in addition to any sort of training that they're already doing?
So I think ICH E6 R3, the draft revision, is really, really good. I think it's
Mm,
excellent. And so I used to say, if you're not going to read anything else, read ICH, because I think it takes and really it. First of all, it's ICH, so it's applicable globally. So that's the first piece of
right.
it.
Hmm.
I think the second piece of it is it's written in fairly easy to understand language. Like reading the Federal Register is a lot different than reading ICH. So I think there's really good learnings from that. I think it depends on what you do. Like there's a new guidance on informed consent. So if you're involved in informed consent, I think that's a guidance you need to read. I think guidances
Hmm.
that are related to what you're doing and what your job responsibilities are a good place to start. If you're working with electronic records, yes, you should be reading the guidances around electronic record. But if you don't really do anything to do with electronic records except use them, then that's not as important. I think it depends on what your role is in the clinical trial as to what documents are valuable to you.
Got it. So one of the services that your organization provides is like inspection readiness. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about like what is inspection readiness and why is it important?
Sure. I don't know. Do we have 5 hours? Because I think I could probably talk about it for 10. I think to sum up inspection, so I think there's inspection readiness and there's inspection preparation. Inspection readiness is something that you should really, it's a steady state. You should be in a state of inspection readiness. We hear a lot about trial master file being inspection ready. A trial master file that's inspection ready means that you have all of the evidence to show the quality conduct of the study, and that documentation is filed in your trial master file based on the milestones of your study. So, for example, if you're in the middle of enrollment, you're probably not going to have your closeout visits filed, right? Because it hasn't been done yet. So does that mean your TMF's not inspection ready? No. It means that for where you're at, if all of your monitoring visit reports and your SIV report and your protocol training and your CVs and your deviation documentation and your ethics approvals, if that's all filed and if you got inspected, you're ready for it, that's an inspection ready. Inspection preparation means you're prepared for the inspection. And this is usually what happens in anticipation of an inspection. So EMEA, MHRA, maybe it's just a routine GCP inspection. You've received notification. You need to get prepared. Same thing, FDA, you filed your NDA, you filed your BLA. You anticipate there'll be an inspection in the next 6 months. You begin inspection preparation. Being inspection prepared, for me, I say it means that what you said you were going to do aligns with what you say you did and what the documentation the TMF shows. So really 3 things. What I said I was going to do is what I say I did, and I have the documentation to prove it. If you can go ahead and answer all the questions related to the study, it aligns with your study plans, right? Because sometimes we say things in study plans, but then we do something very different, right? So we say we're going to audit 10% of our sites, but then we've only done audits on 5% of our sites. That's a non-compliance. And then I say, oh yeah, we audited all the sites we said we were going to audit. Well, no, we didn't because my plan says one thing and the documentation says the other, right? We're going to do protocol training. Well, do we have documentation that we did the protocol training? So
Mhm.
I think that there's kind of 3 components, and all those components have to be in place in order to say that you're inspection prepared. What
Right.
we do is we try to look at what the story the TMF tells and align that with what the organization is saying and what the documentation associated with the study says should happen.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. So do you find so how what does that process look like in order to kind of do that
Sure.
readiness?
So we can
Yeah.
do it a couple of ways. A lot of times clients will come to us and they'll say, hey, we want a mock inspection. And then the next thing I say is, well, when's your inspection? Well, I don't know. We're going to do database lock in 6 months. In my mind, that's not the time to do a mock inspection. That's the time to start inspection preparation. So we might do a workshop very similar to a mock inspection, but not with the culture of what you would get with the mock, right? So with a mock, you get hats on, hats off, you get questions, you get it's a little bit there's a little bit of a threatening feeling from maybe senior management. You better do well on this mock. We don't want to have, it's not a collaborative experience. Our workshops are very collaborative. We focus on understanding what your study plans say, what your procedural documents say. We ask you questions about how you conducted your study, very similar to what you might experience with an inspection. And then we look in your trial master file and we see if it's actually been documented that way. And then where there's disconnect, we help you understand that disconnect, help you write the storyboards or gather the content. Another approach, and it's an approach we've been using recently, is we call it the TMF inspection readiness story of the study. And we look at your SOPs and we look at your study plan and we look at the content you have in the TMF and we look for discrepancies, because we make the assumption that if you said you were going to do something, we would expect evidence that you actually did it. And then that begins conversations with the greater study team. And then that's how we identify greater gaps. The one thing it does do is it's fairly cost effective, and it's a great way to just get an idea of where you're at from a study preparation standpoint and as well as a TMF preparation, right? Because you can have done all these things or say you were going to do all these things, but the trackers aren't filed and the emails aren't filed. So the evidence itself isn't filed, and we pick that up. We also look at just the health of the trial master file in terms of signals for completeness, right? If I have 10 sub-I CVs and I have 2 documents in protocol training, I need to do a more detailed completeness review. The other thing we do is that detailed GCP completeness review, where we look at a study, we look at high-risk sites, we look at the completeness of the TMF, and then we look at the GCP signals within the monitoring visit reports, within IRB submissions, within study communications, and we help the sponsor understand where the risks are from that particular site. And this is where we uncover maybe changes in PIs or unreported SAEs, or things that maybe the sponsor didn't even know about. The CRO took care of it themselves, never told the sponsor, or maybe there's been 3 different study team leads over the life of that study. We help the study team lead that's going to have to speak to all of this. We help them gather the data to help them prepare how they're going to speak to some of the issues. So we can offer varying levels of support, whether it's a high level of risk assessment to full remediation.
Got it. Okay. So in terms of the FDA inspections, maybe for the purpose of this conversation, what are some of the common things FDA inspectors tend to focus on? I always tell people, like, looking at the BIMO manual is like a good place to start to know, here's everything that they're going to consider, right, when they're on site. But I've also been through a couple of FDA audits and they varied quite a bit. So wanted to hear your perspective on that.
So I think it varies from inspector to inspector with the FDA. There's no doubt about it. And whatever's important to them is often where they focus. I had an inspection with an inspector out on the West Coast, and she came from the CRO world. So as she told us, I'm wise to the ways of the CRO. And she really focused on the sponsor's oversight of the CRO. Was there evidence of the oversight of the work that they did? I think there's kind of 2 types of inspections. There's the check the box inspection, where they come in, they follow the BIMO, they go yay, and they go home. And then there's the I'm here because there's an issue. I'm here because when they were doing the review, they saw questions around the data. They saw that there were extensive number of deviations around dosing. They want to understand what's the impact of the overall subject safety, data integrity, and human subject protection on that particular issue. So I think you have kind of 2 different inspections. What you need to do is you need to figure out, why are they here? Are they here because it's just a routine inspection? Or is there something that I know about in my trial, right? Like, I know my trial better than anybody else. I know there's an issue. My guess is they're going to come and focus on that issue, right? Especially if they do a lot of questions around specific topics as they're getting information about the trial, we know that they're probably going to send an inspector out to kind of focus on that. And then the last piece is historical inspections. I had a client that had a finding around gaps in protocol training. So when they came back for their next submission, they focused primarily on how they managed their protocol training, how they had oversight of it, how they documented it. They really did a thorough review to make sure that what they committed to in their response to their last 483, they had actually done.
Got it. That's helpful. And the BIMO manual, does that apply to drug and device trials, or is it specific to device trials? Do you know?
So BIMO applies to biologics and to pharmaceuticals.
Pharmaceuticals, got it. Okay. Um, how do we prepare our investigator sites for potential inspections? Like, what should be the role of the sponsor or the CRO in that case?
Yeah, so we have an approach that is, it's not an audit. A lot of times sites will, or sponsors will audit their sites that they think are high risk. It's similar to that story of the study I talked about earlier. We
Mhm.
understand what's in the TMF. Generally, we've done our risk review of the site, so we know where the potential issues are. And then we go out to the site to make sure they're prepared, right? We coach them on how to respond to issues. We bring attention to the things that are potentially a problem. We may collect content to add to the TMF. It's really about being a friend of the site and giving them the confidence that they need to perform well, making sure that they don't have any surprises, right? My idea of a successful inspection is no surprises, right? I can't undo what's been done. I can't prevent a 483. What I can do is tell you where you can expect a 483 and help you put in mitigations to maybe prevent that 483 or lessen the impact of the 483. If you can convince an inspector that you identified the problem, that you're taking actions to remediate the problem, and that you are monitoring for it to reoccur, that it doesn't reoccur, sometimes you can save yourself a 483.
Makes sense. So being a friend and a partner basically with sites rather than saying, yeah, we're here to audit you.
I really believe that inspection preparation is about collaborative partnership, whether it's
Mhm.
within your organization, with your investigator sites, or even with the agency itself, right? If everybody works together in a collaborative manner, the outcome is always better than if there's adversarial relationships.
Absolutely. What are some of the most common findings or observations during regulatory inspections?
Sure. So all of the FDA, MHRA, EMA, they all publish annually, and it's usually about 2 years behind. Most common findings. I actually, it doesn't really change too much year to year. They're focused on data integrity. They're focused on oversight, a huge focus on oversight these last couple of years. Um, Protocol compliance. It's one thing that I don't know that sponsors spend enough time managing, and that's their protocol deviations, their review of the deviations actively throughout the trial, making sure that if they find patterns in deviation, they do something to remediate. I think that's really critical. And I find that organizations that have a really good, robust process in place for managing protocol deviations are generally better prepared for inspections.
Got it. You mentioned oversight a couple of times in this conversation. So I wanted to maybe ask you, how do you define oversight, and what are some ways sponsors can provide adequate oversight?
Yeah, so I kind of equate oversight as leaving your child with a babysitter. So you check on your child, right? So it's the same idea with your trial master file. It's the same idea with your trial. You're not going to drop your study, your greatest asset, off with the CRO and pick it up at the end of the trial. So you want to make sure that you're periodically reviewing what's going on, having good conversations, having good meetings, and then just check, right? Believe, but confirm. Right. So, yes, I understand what you're saying to me. Yes, I believe what you're saying to me. But oh, by the way, I'm going to read my monitoring visit reports. I'm going to be looking at my study team meetings, and I'm going to have key performance indicators that I'm tracking and I'm following up. And most importantly, I'm taking action on when I meet a threshold, right? So if I establish thresholds for quality indicators, I'm going to take action if we achieve that threshold.
Mhm. Makes sense. So don't skip your team meetings with their CRO. Do them, on a weekly basis. Yeah,
Right,
exactly.
right.
And then
And
actually,
you know,
yeah,
if there's smoke, there's probably fire. So if you're getting inklings about issues, you need to follow up on them. You can't just trust that your CRO is going to take care of them because they're
absolutely.
probably not.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is your most valuable asset for you as an organization, right? It's your drug. Without your drug, you don't have an organization. And so you need to not just turn it over to a CRO to manage, you need to be actively involved in it.
Yeah. I like to say, as a sponsor, you want to be in the clouds and also in the dirt and really get your hands dirty when you're
Exactly.
working with the CRO
Yes.
or any outsourcing partner. Um, what are some of the best practices for correcting and preventing inspection findings? Um, do you have any suggestions on that, especially when you find out things at the last minute when you're actually doing audit readiness or inspection readiness? Like, do you put memo to files in place? Does that even work, or how do you address issues that might be too late to fix?
So I think memos to file are last resort. I don't like them. I think that they call out like, oh my gosh, this is missing. This is an issue. Like writing a note to file that something is missing. Well, it's not there, so it probably is missing. So putting in a note to file stating it's missing is probably not a good idea. I think that making every effort to ensure that everything has been filed that's available is a really good way to prevent findings. I also think that good oversight through the life of the study is a great way to prevent inspection findings. But sometimes you can't do that. Sometimes resourcing is short, or you've acquired the asset from somebody else halfway through the study, or half the study team's left, and you can't do that. And then in that case, I think understanding your story, understanding the good, the bad, the ugly, and being prepared to speak to it, and where you have things that need to be remediated, remediate them. And when you have something that you can't remediate, then be prepared to talk about how you're going to prevent it for the future and how you're going to assess it, and maybe even what you've done with your other active studies. I believe that honesty is the best policy during an inspection. And so I really encourage my clients to come clean at the very beginning, like, hey, want to let you know that during our inspection preparation, we identified that we did a really poor job of documenting protocol deviations. And we put in place this, and this. We did an analysis of this, and this to make sure that we had captured all of our deviations. That's a good thing. That's owning it and declaring what you've done to prevent it and remediate it.
Makes sense. Anything else you'd like to add to that?
No, I think, we've covered it.
Yeah. Are there any differences between the different types of inspection, like FDA versus EMEA or MHRA? I know there's nuances with the PMDA, like when we're having an audit with the PMDA, they like to see all the files like laid out in front of you, versus the FDA will ask for documents and then you give them whatever they ask for. So wanted to see if there were any differences that you would like to share with us with the different agencies.
Sure. So I think the FDA is unpredictable. It's everything from provide me the documents to here's the thumb drive, put them here, to I want to see them in your TMF, please navigate for me, or can I please have access to your TMF? So it's really, we see everything with the FDA. So it's completely not predictable. In some ways that makes it harder to prepare because you have to prepare for all options, right? EMA,
Mm-hmm.
MHRA, they want access generally prior to the inspection and usually for 3 months after the inspection. And they're going to be leveraging all systems. They're going to be looking for your audit trails from all your systems. Any system where you maintain TMF content, they will want access. That's different than the FDA.
Got it. Okay. So how do you give access to the FDA? Do you just give, I know sometimes sponsors have multiple trials in a given TMF. So do you just give access to a particular trial, or certain set of documents? How does that work?
So the system's configured generally for an inspector access, and that system configuration limits their access to usually approved files and to the single study that's being inspected. And so that's really all done through technology.
Got it. Okay. Are there any of your favorite TMF providers that you'd like to give a shout out to?
Sure. So we are vendor agnostic. I'm really proud of. I believe that the best TMF for any organization is the TMF that they have. So I am not a fan of coming into an organization and evaluating their TMF and then telling them to make a change. In fact, when they tell me they're going to make a change, I try to discourage it because I don't think there's any single solution out there that addresses everybody's needs, right? It depends on your organization. If you're a small startup with 3 studies, then you don't need the Cadillac. If you have
Right.
5 programs and you've got 3 submissions coming up in the next 5 years, then you may want a more complex system and more robust system. It really depends on the maturity of your organization, and are you having your CROs use their TMF, and you really only need a place for the content you generate and then a process for archiving. So what we do is we go in and we do a current state assessment, and then we do a future state recommendation. And that is a roadmap for implementing different systems and different processes at different points in your organizational's development, right? If you're getting ready to start a pivotal trial and it's with a boutique CRO, that's a different situation than your first time in human study, right? The needs are different. And so we like to do that assessment to help you put your resourcing in the right location.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there any providers that come to mind that you think do a good job with TMF?
I think they all do a different, when I say I'm vendor agnostic, I really am. We've had partnerships with many of them, and no matter who I mention, I'll leave somebody out. So I think what I would just say is if you're considering a TMF, the best thing to do is start with establishing your user requirements and then talking to a lot of different organizations and going to either I'll put a plug in there for the CDISC interchange, which is happening in October in Phoenix area in Arizona, Scottsdale, I think it is, because the vendors will all be there. It's a great opportunity to evaluate them side by side. If you have a system, I'd recommend that you do a current assessment and we can look at what technology is available for that system and how do you make sure you have all the latest and greatest bells and whistles to meet your needs. So I really, I think all of the systems do a great job.
Great. I think the reason I was asking that question was I've been part of some smaller organizations that tend to use SharePoint or Dropbox to manage their trial master file needs basically. And I wanted to see what your thoughts were in terms of using tools like that are not set up for clinical research necessarily.
Yeah. So the first thing is it needs to be a validated system. So you need to use the Dropbox that's validated. You need Box. Box has a validated environment, and we have validated SharePoint for people. Is it my first choice? Never. That is never my first choice because they're not fit for purpose. They weren't designed to be a TMF, right? The value of a TMF is metadata and reporting and metrics, and that's really hard to do with those basic, I'll call them basic systems. However, if you're a startup company and you don't have any money and your CRO is holding all of your content and you have a few documents that you need to store, then a validated SharePoint is an option. Do I ever recommend it? No, I don't. But I will go in and help a company work within their constraints of their resourcing until they're prepared that they can get to the point where they're using a validated system. And then I think the other piece is I make sure that they have an archiving process where they can archive in a validated environment. There's good vendors out there that provide an archive environment of the TMF where you can access it for inspection. And so if the sponsor themselves aren't going to have a TMF where they can archive content, there's vendors out there that can provide that to them.
Got it. What do you mean by validated SharePoint? Can we just use one that's out of the box, or does something need to be done to it?
You have to validate it in your environment. You can't just go out of box SharePoint and say, oh, it's validated. You have to validating SharePoint is challenging, but it can be done.
Got it. Okay. And then you mentioned something about archiving. What does that mean? Like you said, archiving.
So archiving means that you're limiting access to the content, that it's secured, that you'll be able to recall it, and should you need to, that people. It's less apt to have changes made to it. It's very controlled, and it is a validated environment. And then you're able to look at the audit trails for access.
Got it. Okay. Can you tell a little bit more about the validating SharePoint? How does that work?
Yeah, so I will tell you, I am not a validation expert.
That's
We
right.
do validation within our organization, but I
Yeah.
think validation is really about giving you the confidence that the system is going to do what you think it's going to do. So you establish what you want it to do, and then you prove that the system does what it is you want it to do, and then you document all of that. And then you maintain it in that state through change control. And if you make changes, then you reevaluate for the changes you made.
Thank you. That's really good way to explain it. Thank you. I could never do that. What strategies can sponsors, CROs, and even sites use to manage inspection anxiety among staff members?
Yeah, so I think practice, it's like anything. If you've practiced it enough time, you're going to have confidence in it. One of the
Mhm.
things I like about a mock inspection is it's an opportunity to test things out. So maybe you're really not sure how to speak to a series of protocol deviations you had. Having the mock inspector focus on that a little bit gives you a chance to practice different responses and see how they're received, see, where there's opportunities for improvement. I think that maintaining a non-threatening environment through preparation is a really good way to minimize inspection anxiety. A little bit of anxiety when you have to perform is never a bad thing, but anxiety that immobilizes you is a really bad thing. And so I think it's about managing the level of pressure and anxiety and the amount of time people have to practice and prepare.
Got it. Yeah, I agree. And I like the advice about like practice kind of makes you less anxious, I suppose, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I watched a movie. What was the name of it? I can't remember the name. I just watched it this week, and it was about these kids and the football team. It reminded me of the Mighty Ducks a little bit, but just for football. But there was this kid, and he only could kick the field goals in practice. But when it came to game time, he got all nervous. There was a girl in the stands that was always there. She made him all nervous, and he could never score at the field goal. And what the coach said to him is, put pressure on yourself in practice to do your very best to excel, so that when it comes time for the game, it's actually less pressure. And it's kind of the same thing. If you
Right.
put pressure on yourself in all the practices and you do your best and you want to get things right, then when it comes time to perform in the inspection, it's actually easier. It's like, wow, that's not as bad as I thought it was.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. So to put stress on yourself when you're training or getting ready,
Right.
and then when it's game time, it's gonna be much smoother.
It'll just
Uh,
be, hey, it's just like another day in the office.
right. Right. Um, the other things I want to ask you, in what ways might the current GCP guidelines need to adapt to accommodate real world evidence studies? I think we're seeing more and more real world studies with EUMDR and so on. So I wanted to see how can we still work within the GCP framework and conduct registry studies.
Yeah, I think we're starting to see some more guidances around this from the different health authorities. I think that's really good. The TMF reference model actually came up with a structure for real world studies, so that's good as well. So I think we are starting to adapt. I think the same thing is true for decentralized clinical trials, right? The content we need for a decentralized clinical trial is sometimes different than the content we need for a traditional study. And so I think what regulations need to do is to take into account all the various ways that we manage a clinical trial and make it more about oversight and quality, right? The more, as opposed to being prescriptive about the things you need to do. So I think with the final version of R3, we're going to see a real focus on risk management, on quality indicators, on just measuring quality throughout the life of the trial, and certainly a focus on oversight.
Got it. You mentioned something. There was a new release of. Did you mean the E3 guidance, or were you referring to something else?
So I was afraid you were going to ask me that question, and I saw it the other day. It came across my desk, and I thought, oh, I'm going to read that later, and I haven't read it yet. But I really feel like there was an FDA guidance that came out on real world evidence studies and how they're conducted.
Got it. Okay. No worries. Yeah, I can check it out, and then I can link it in the show notes for people. Also, if you remember the movie that you were talking about, you can let me know after the podcast interview.
Okay.
Link it as well for people to check.
I'll tell you, it was an Adam Sandler movie, if that helps. He
Amazon.
was one of the directors in it, but yes, I can
Got it.
get you that.
Yeah. How has the implementation of GCP involved with digital technologies and decentralized trials? I think we kind of touched on that. It's like you said, there's new guidance documents coming that might be addressing some of those topics. Is there anything in specific that comes to mind?
In terms of how these studies are conducted, or
No, how has the implementation of GCP evolved with new technologies? Like has it does the way GCP get implemented change with the decentralized clinical trials, or are the expectations still the same?
I think the GCP is harder to control with the decentralized clinical trials because you don't have direct access to the patient oftentimes. Where the data is being collected is in an area where maybe people haven't received a lot of training. So having quality oversight of those trials, getting the documentation to give evidence that the trials were conducted to GCP is a little bit more challenging, right? How do you have quality oversight of something you can't see and something where you don't have documentation? So I think protocol training becomes way more important. Selection of vendors becomes really important. And then oversight and data oversight and ways of looking at data quality is really critical.
Right. At the start of our conversation, you mentioned like most studies are like global, even if it's US and Canada. So what strategies can be employed to harmonize GCP interpretations across different regulatory bodies globally?
Yeah, so I think ICHE 6 R3 is going to do that in a large way, right? We're starting to get, so I've been in the business a long time. I probably shouldn't say this, but I remember I've been around longer than ICHE 6. So I remember when I came into research and I was looking for a way to do things, and there was no guidance for me, right? Then ICHE 6 came along and it gave me a little bit of guidance, and then it gave me a little bit more, and then each revision gives me a little bit more guidance around it. And so I think that is, as we get more and more GCP guidance, as we get more and more regulatory expectations, we need more and more process. And then that becomes challenging for these smaller companies to know even what processes they need and when they need them, right? And what's the degree of forgiveness for I'm a new company, right? I'm a new company, but like I said to a client this morning, you develop your drugs through in-licensing. You in-license a drug, you have a terrible TMF, and then you try to explain it that way. You need a process for how you in-license these drugs so that you get all of the documentation as part of the in-licensing process, right? So I think that building processes around how you do your business, whether it's decentralized, whether it's through acquisitions, whether it's through new chemical entities that you develop through commercialization, you need processes to support that and to standardize it to give you good data quality.
What do you say? End licensing? Is that the word you
Yeah.
use?
So in other words, a company acquires a license to develop a drug from maybe an academic institution or a smaller startup company.
Right. Okay. Got it. Okay. I think those were all my questions. I wanted to maybe wrap up our conversation to see if you had any resources as it pertains to inspection readiness or things that you found to be helpful in your career. I mean, obviously I'll link to the book, your book, in the show notes for people to check it out and if they want to purchase a copy. But yeah, any other tools and resources that you'd like to share with people that you think will help them in their career?
Yeah, so I can talk about a couple of things. Obviously, the book, if you do want to order the book, we'll give you the link and you can use the code GCP25 and get 25% off the book. So that really is hopefully helpful. I think that obviously, so using that as a reference tool, I read warning letters. I think that's really valuable. I think that learning from other people's mistakes versus making the mistakes myself is a good way to learn. I do read the guidances. I find them valuable. There's a webinar that the FDA, MHRA, and Health Canada did earlier this year. I think it was in February. They do it like every other year. It's a GCP webinar, and I think you can actually access it on YouTube, and it's really good. It helps you understand the agency's thinking on, their perspective on inspections and what their expectations are.
Great.
I do have the name of it is a real world evidence considerations regarding non-interventional studies for drug and biologics. It's a guidance that came out in March of 2024, and that Adam Sandler movie was Home Team. Great, it's a great movie, great family movie. But
Home Team, okay, perfect.
Yeah, but I thought it was a great analogy.
Well, you kind of encouraged me to watch some movies. I'm really not that good at like watching movies.
It's a fun one. It's fun.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's I think it's funny, and I'm sitting here thinking, is there anything in it that isn't for family movie night? Certainly for older kid family movie night, it's fine.
Cool. Any other conferences that you like to go to? I know you mentioned one about the CDisc one that's coming up later in the year.
Yeah, I have to be careful. I don't want to make plugs or not make plugs, but I can tell you that a CDisc is great. The TMF, if you're interested in TMF inspection readiness, it's a great conference. And then obviously you mentioned that we met at Scope. I think Scope's an awesome opportunity. I learned a lot at Scope this year. There's a new EMEA guidance on IP accountability and the sponsor's responsibilities. And one of the, a sponsor company shared their experience with some findings through the FDA. I applaud them and their willingness to share their experience, but I find I pick up a lot of new information at Scope.
Got it. Okay. Just for people that are not familiar with acronyms, NDA is new drug approval, BLA is application, and BLA is biologics
licensing agreement.
Application,
and biologics licensing application.
Yeah, and then EMEA is the European Medical Agency, right? Is that right?
Correct. And MHRA is the UK version of that.
Got it. Okay. I think those were all my questions. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience before we call it a day?
No, I appreciate that. Certainly check out, I've had some recent blogs that I published about like when's a good time to get some outside help on things, organizations trying to do everything themselves. If nothing else, getting a third party's input kind of lets you know what other companies are doing, what's working. It's really hard to stay up to date on all the regulations. So somebody whose job it is to do that is sometimes really helpful to companies.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Donna, for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Clinical Trial Podcast. For more exclusive clinical research content to get you to the top of your game, head on over to clinicaltrialpodcast.com.